The boy had been following the tracks since morning, and the mountain had been climbing the whole time. He walked between the rails when the ballast let him and along the ties when it didn't. His canvas pack rode light across his shoulders. Too light. He had eaten the last heel of bread some hour before noon, standing at a switch tie in a stand of birch, watching a kingfisher work a creek that ran parallel to the grade. The bread had been 3 days old and dry as a shingle. He chewed it slowly and swallowed and kept walking. He had $7 in his front pocket and a hollow feeling under his ribs he had learned to ignore, and a jacket that had been through 2 winters and was starting to think about a third. He had not seen another person since the previous afternoon, when an old man in a pickup had passed him on the county road below and slowed enough to look, and then kept going. That had been all right. That had been what he had wanted. The tracks climbed steadily through a country that had gone thin and quiet. Pine on both sides. Deer trails crossing the right-of-way and disappearing again. A hawk circling in the higher air. The kind of place where the world stops pretending it needs anyone. He came around a shoulder of rock in the middle of the afternoon, and the tunnel was there. He stopped without deciding to. The grade steepened into a rock cut, and where the cut ended, a black hole opened in the mountain. Concrete arches weathered gray and streaked with mineral bleed. The mouth of it may be 18 feet at the crown. He had walked into tunnels before. He knew how the air came at you. But the tunnel was not what stopped him. Just to the west of the mouth, set on a broad shelf of leveled ground where a spur line curved off the main and dead-ended in a rotted timber bumper, stood a water tower. He had seen water towers in picture books and once from the back of a bus. He had never stood beneath one. This one had been built of vertical wooden staves banded with iron hoops the color of dried blood, and it rose 30 feet or better on 4 iron legs bolted to concrete footings gone green with moss. The tank at the top sat capped with a conical roof of shingle, so old the shingles had curled in on themselves like the pages of a wet book. A long iron spout hung from the tank's belly on a counterweighted arm, folded flat now against the tower's side. It had not been swung down for a train in a long time. Nothing about the tower said it was still in use. Nothing about it said it had been dismantled either. It stood there the way certain old things stand, past the reach of the world that made them. Occupying a country of its own, he walked closer. The base of the tower was a pump house of poured concrete, and the door had been chained and padlocked, and the chain had rusted into the door, and the door had rusted into the frame. He tugged it once out of habit. Nothing. He stepped back and looked up along the iron leg on the tunnel side, and that was when he saw it. Between the pump house roof and the underside of the tank, tucked into the framework of the tower's cross braces, there was a room, not a large room, a small square structure of vertical wood plank, tar-papered on the roof, a single window facing the tracks. It sat perhaps 20 feet up, cradled inside the tower's iron skeleton the way an egg sits inside a nest. From directly beneath he could see it. From the tracks he had walked in on, 30 yards back, he had not seen it at all. The angle had been wrong. The tank had blocked it. A ladder ran up the near leg. Iron rungs bolted through the leg's flange, spaced 15 inches, blooming with the same dried blood rust as the hoops. It climbed to a small platform under the room's door. He stood in the ballast at the base of the tower and looked up and listened. That was when the train came. He did not hear it first. He felt it. A tremor worked up through the ballast into the soles of his boots, low and building, the kind of pressure that had a train's shape before it had a train's sound. He stepped off the roadbed and pressed himself into the timber of the tower's leg. The sound arrived a beat later, a rising iron thunder from the cut behind him, and then the locomotive came around the shoulder, headlamp on in the afternoon light, and blew through the water stop without slowing. No whistle, no brake. The engineer did not so much as glance at the tower. The tower had not been part of anyone's route in a long time, and the train ran through the way water runs through a channel it has cut for itself over years. Cars followed. Boxcars, tankers, flatbeds, more boxcars. The wind of them pressed his jacket flat against his ribs. The whole tower shook. He could feel it move against his shoulder blades. Not much. The kind of movement a big thing does when a bigger thing goes past it. The last car cleared and dwindled into the tunnel mouth, and the sound folded down into the mountain and was gone. He stood in the settling dust and looked up at the room again. No body had looked at that window. The train had gone straight past it and into the tunnel and had not seen it. Nobody in the world knew there was a window there. He was not sure he knew what he was looking at even now. He did not decide to climb. His hands just found the ladder. That was how it worked with him. His body figured out what his thinking was still trying to say. The iron was cold under his palms, and the rust came off in dry flakes. He climbed slowly, testing each rung with his weight before shifting to the next. 2 of them flexed more than he liked. He put his boots at the outer edges where the flange was solid and kept climbing. The platform under the door was a square of planked wood maybe 4 feet on a side, framed by iron rail. He pulled himself onto it and stood. The planks felt solid. He tested them one at a time by rocking his weight. They held. The door was a single slab of vertical plank, weathered gray-silver, latched with a wooden bar dropped into iron hooks. No padlock. Nothing had ever needed a padlock this far off the ground. He lifted the bar and set it against the wall and pulled the door. It came grudging, dragging at the bottom, the wood swollen from years of weather. Inside was black. He stepped in. The air was still and dry, and smelled of wood and iron and old paper. The window above the tracks let in a rectangle of afternoon light that fell across the plank floor and lit the far wall. He stood in the doorway and let his eyes settle, and slowly the room came into view. It was 10 feet by 12, roughly. Ceiling 7 feet at the peak, sloping down toward the eaves. Vertical plank walls, tar-papered on the outside, tongue and groove on the inside, honey brown where the light touched them and dark as coal where it did not. A cot frame in the corner nearest the door, welded angle iron, canvas sling, collapsed to a black rag on the floor. A shelf running the length of the west wall, empty except for a coffee tin gone the color of the wall behind it. A wood stove in the corner opposite the cot, small cast iron, pot-bellied with a bent stovepipe rising from its top through a ceramic collar in the ceiling. He stepped further in. A tool chest under the window. A 3-legged stool tipped over near the stove. A ceramic fitting is set into the north wall at waist height with a brass tap sticking out of it, and a small tin cup hanging from a nail beside it on a length of copper wire. And on the shelf, half tucked against a rag of what might once have been a curtain, a small book bound in green cloth. He picked nothing up, not yet. He walked the floor first, heel to toe counting. 10 feet along the north wall. 11 along the east. He stomped it in 3 places. It was solid. Whoever had built this room had built it to be lived in. He went to the ceramic fitting first. The brass tap was tarnished nearly black. He turned it. It resisted, then gave. Nothing came out. He turned it further and put his ear close. There was a faint hiss of air. Not water, but not dead either. The pipe was not clogged, solid. Somewhere above him a line ran to somewhere higher, and that somewhere higher had once fed the tank, and it might feed the tank still if he could find its source. He closed the tap. He went to the stove next. The firebox door swung with a soft grate of hinge. Inside was the ash of an old fire, undisturbed, packed down by decades of its own weight. He put his hand up the stovepipe as far as he could reach. Cold, dry, he tapped the pipe. It rang clean. No bird nest, no blockage he could feel. The ceramic collar where the pipe met the ceiling looked sound. He went to the tool chest and lifted the lid. It came up easily. Inside, a rusted hand file, a pair of pliers with the jaws seized, a paintbrush fused solid in a tin of ancient primer, a rolled-up canvas apron gone stiff, a hank of hemp cord still supple enough to bend, a small oil can with the neck bent, a spirit level in a wooden case. He took the level out and set it on the shelf and adjusted it. The bubble drifted. Then it stopped. Then it held. Still true. He went to the shelf last. The book was smaller than he expected. 6 inches by 4 maybe. Green cloth boards went soft at the corners. He lifted it. Dust rose off the cover in a thin sheet. He carried it to the window and stood in the last of the afternoon light and opened it. The first page had been inked in careful hand. Mountain Division. Tank number 14. Keeper's register below that in the same hand. A first entry dated with a month and day only. No year, filled and tested. Pump running clean. Draw at 82 gallons per minute. Line from Cold Spring holding at pressure. Keeper on station. He turned the page. Another entry. Then another. Weekly logs, mostly. Temperature of the water. Level of the tank. Notes on ice in the coldest months. Notes on the draw of trains taking on water in them. The hand was neat and patient and did not waste words. He turned pages. The entries continued for a long time. Months, then years. The handwriting changed twice. 2 other keepers followed the first. Each of them signed off with a short line. Handing off. Line in good order. And the next hand picked up without ceremony and kept the register going. He turned to the last written page and stopped. The final entry was different. It had been made in a hand he had not seen before. Not a keeper's hand. Cleaner. More administrative. Ink darker, as if from a fountain pen used to write forms. He read it once. Then he closed the book and did not read it again that night. Some things wanted to be read only once until you had grown into them. He set the log book on the shelf and stood in the darkening room. Then he pulled the door closed and dropped the wooden bar back into its hooks from the inside, where a second set of iron hooks had been mounted for that exact purpose by someone who had understood that the door might sometimes be barred from within. He slept that night on the plank floor with his jacket bunched under his head and the pack against his ribs and his boots on. He did not risk the cot frame. He did not build a fire. He did not light a candle. He lay in the dark and listened to the mountain settle around the tower, and to the tower settle around him, and to the very small sound of his own breathing in a room that had heard no breathing for a long time. Sometime after midnight a train passed below. He felt it before he heard it. The whole tower moved half an inch and moved back. Dust drifted down from the rafters in a fine dry mist and settled on his face. He did not open his eyes. He lay there and let the train pass through him and past him and into the tunnel, and when it was gone the tower resettled and he slept. He woke to gray light and the sound of wind in the pines, and for a moment he did not know where he was. Then the shape of the ceiling came clear and he remembered. He sat up on the floor and put his hand on the plank and pushed himself to standing, and stood a moment with his palm flat against the north wall, feeling the cold that had come through it in the night and would come through it every night until he did something about it. He went to the brass tap first. He held the tin cup under it and turned the tap. The hiss of air came again, and then something clicked in the pipe somewhere above, and a drop of water fell into the cup. Then another. Then a thin trickle that ran the color of iron for a moment, and then ran clear. He filled the cup to the brim and watched it a long time before he tasted it. Cold, mineral, sweet at the finish. He drank the cup down and refilled it and drank again. The line was alive. Somewhere above him, water was still moving through pipe, coming down from a source high enough to give it pressure. The tank overhead was probably dry. The pipe running to the tank had probably been valved off years ago. But the pipe that fed the service tap in the room ran off a branch below that valve, and it ran on gravity, and it ran still. He needed to see the source. He stepped out onto the platform and pulled the door shut and dropped down the ladder rung by rung. The morning was cold enough to see his breath. He crossed the tracks and struck up the slope on the west side of the tower, working uphill through the pines. The logbook had made a rough sketch on one of its early pages. Cold Spring, marked with a small cross and the notation west slope. Above the tank, 400 feet elevation gain. He climbed by the sketch and by the smell of things, and by the pull in his legs that told him roughly what 400 feet of elevation felt like. He found it after an hour. A wooden spring house half collapsed in a hollow between two granite outcrops. Cedar shakes on the roof, gone silver. The door had rotted off its hinges and lay flat in the pine duff beside the opening. He stooped and looked inside. The pool was still there, cut into the rock, lined with mortared fieldstone that had gone green with slow water at the edges. The spring came out of a cleft in the granite at the back and ran clear over a bed of gravel and left through an iron pipe set at the pool's lip. The pipe went into the ground and ran downhill under root and stone to the tower below. He knelt at the pool and put his palm flat on the pipe where it left the stone. He could feel the water moving through it. A steady low pull, the way you feel a horse breathing if you rest your hand on its side. He cupped water from the pool and drank. Then he sat back on his heels and looked at the spring house, and at the pool and at the pipe, and understood what he had. He came down the mountain by a different route to see if there was another way in, and there was not. The spring house did not connect to any trail. The pipe ran buried the whole way. From the tracks below, no one would ever look up and see the spring. From the ridge above, no one would ever look down and see the tower. The two things had been joined by a line laid in the ground by men who had known that the line would need to be forgotten, and it had been. He came back to the tower in the middle of the afternoon and drank a full cup at the brass tap and refilled his canteen and sat on the platform outside the door and looked out over the tracks and thought. He needed food. He needed a way to make a fire that would not send smoke up out of a tower nobody was supposed to be inside of. He needed hardware to fix what was broken and would break. He needed things he could not find on a mountain and would have to walk down and buy. He walked down that afternoon. It took him 4 hours to reach the valley town. He crossed the county road when nothing was coming and came in by a back way, past a lumber yard and a boarded-up feed store, and walked the main street with his cap pulled low and did not look at anyone and was not looked at. The hardware store was in a brick building on the corner. Inside it smelled of oil and cut wood, and the sweet dust that comes off feed sacks. A woman at the counter looked up when he came in and looked at him for a long second, and then looked back at her paper without saying anything. And he understood that this was a town that had seen enough boys walking through it to know how to leave them alone. He spent his $7 carefully, a box of stick matches in a tin, a candle tin with a dozen tallow candles wrapped in wax paper, a small file, a short length of galvanized flashing, a handful of wood screws, machine bolts, a pair of small hinges, a cloth sack of dry rice, a smaller sack of dry beans, a tin of lard sealed, a bar of yellow soap, a square of chewing gum he bought last with the change in his palm and did not open, $2 and a nickel back in his pocket. He walked out the way he had come in and did not look back at the woman. Half a mile above the town, on the way back to the tracks, he passed a section shed that had been abandoned longer than anything else along the line. He had noted it that morning. He went in now. Inside were the leaves of men who had once maintained this stretch of rail. A stack of pine boards, some cupped, some straight, a coil of stovepipe wire, an iron poker, a tin of penetrating oil half full, a canvas tarp folded in a corner, chewed at one edge by mice but mostly whole. He took what he could carry, 3 boards under one arm, the tarp bundled over his shoulder, the wire and the poker and the oil tin loaded into his pack. He came back to the tower in the last of the daylight and stood at the base of the ladder and looked up at what he was doing. Then he began to move it up, board by board, the tarp last. He tied each load to a length of cord he had cut from the section shed's coil and hoisted it up to the platform and untied it and lowered the rope for the next load. It took him past dark. He worked by feel more than sight. When it was all up, he climbed up himself and pulled the last of it inside and dropped the wooden bar into its hooks and stood in the pitch dark of the room with his hands on his knees and his lungs burning cold and clean. Then he lit a candle. The little flame took hold and grew and threw its light against the wall. He set the candle on the shelf in the tin cup and stood in the middle of the room and looked at what he had. Boards, tarp, wire, oil, screws, matches, rice, beans, lard, and a room that would hold them. The stove came first because it had to. The nights had already told him what the room did without heat. The plank walls were fitted well, but they were plank walls, and cold walked through plank the way rain walks through a colander. He had felt it every night since the first, in his hips and his shoulders on the floor, and in the tip of his nose in the small hours. He needed the stove, and he needed it to draw clean, and he needed the smoke to go somewhere that nobody would look at. He spent a morning on the stovepipe. He took the pipe down section by section. 3 sections, each 18 inches, telescoped together with quarter-turn locks that had corroded but still worked. He carried them to the platform outside and ran a wire brush he had made from a scrap of the flashing folded and doubled through each section, and knocked loose 40 years of soot and one small dry nest that some bird had built and then given up on. He wiped each section clean and reassembled them, and set them back into the ceramic collar in the ceiling. He built a small fire, pencil shavings from the corner of one of the pine boards, a twist of dry pine needle he had gathered on the way up, 2 sticks of split pine no thicker than his thumb. He struck a match and held it to the shavings and watched them catch. The little fire took and grew, and he added a stick and closed the firebox door and stood back and watched the pipe. Nothing. For a long moment the smoke pooled at the top of the firebox and pushed at the joints, and he thought the pipe was blocked after all. Then the draw took place. He felt it in the air of the room before he saw it. The pooled smoke thinned and lifted and went up the pipe and disappeared into the ceramic collar and did not come back. He went outside and climbed the outer ladder up along the tower's leg to the level of the tank and looked. The pipe from the room's ceiling ran along the underside of the tank's floor and bent upward and vented through a small iron cap set flush against the tank's outer shell. The smoke came out of the cap and rose along the tank's side and met the underside of the conical roof and spread there and cooled and drifted out through the gap where the roof met the shell. By the time it reached open air above the tower, there was no smoke at all, just warmed air, invisible against the pines. Whoever had built the room had built the flue to hide the fire. He did not know why. He did not need to know why. He climbed back down and sat by the stove and warmed his hands and watched the flame move behind the firebox grate and did not say anything to anyone, because there was nobody to say anything to, and because some things did not need saying. The platform came next. He built it from the section shed boards. 2 long boards for the sleeping surface, cut to length with the file used as a saw when he had to, and the poker used as a wedge to split what the file could not cut. 2 shorter cross supports laid across the cot frame. He notched the ends of the cross supports with the file until they seated into the cot's angle iron and held it without moving. He laid the tarp over the boards, folded to 4 thicknesses, and it made a sleeping surface that was not soft, but was not the floor. He rebuilt the shelf. He fixed the door. He used the oil to free the hinges of the tool chest and the seized latch of the firebox. By the 4th night he was sleeping warm. Then the big train came. It came at some hour past 2 in the morning. He felt it before he heard it, the way he had felt every train before it. But this one was different from the start. The tremor started deeper. It came up through the tower's iron legs and into the wood, and into the frame of the cot, and into his back where his back was pressed against the folded tarp. It was built for longer than any train he had felt. He was awake before the sound arrived. The sound arrived as pressure. The locomotive blew out of the cut and came under the tower, and the whole tower moved. Not the half-inch of the first night. Something larger. He felt the wood of the room flex around him. Something in the wall creaked. Something else in the roof gave a small pop. He sat up on the platform and put his hand out to the wall for balance. The stovepipe joint went first. The middle section slipped from the top section with a small metallic sigh that he heard over the freight thunder because it was so close to his ear. The joint parted maybe half an inch, and smoke began to escape into the room in a thin gray plume. He was off the platform before he thought about it. He grabbed the pipe with both hands, one above the joint and one below, and pressed the sections back together and held them. The pipe was hot, hotter than he had expected. It burned through his palms, and he held it anyway. Because letting go meant a room full of smoke, and a room full of smoke meant the fire out, and the fire out meant a cold night. And a cold night meant nothing at all, compared to what smoke coming out of a water tower that nobody was supposed to be inside of would mean if the wrong person happened to be watching. The train took 4 minutes to pass. He counted by breathing. His palms burned. He held the pipe. The tower shook and settled and shook, and the smoke stopped seeping, and the joint held under his grip, and the last car cleared, and the sound folded down into the tunnel and was gone. He let go of the pipe. He sat down on the plank floor with his hands on his knees and looked at his palms. Red across both, blistered on the right at the base of the thumb. He got up and went to the brass tap and ran cold water over them and stood there a long time. Then he sat down and thought. He had bolted the pipe sections together at the joints with wire wraps that had not held. The tremor of a train that big had shaken them loose. What he needed was through bolts. He had bought machine bolts at the hardware store for exactly this kind of problem, and he had used none of them on the pipe because it had not occurred to him that the pipe would need them. He had assumed the wire would do. The wire was for 4 small trains. It was not done for the 5th. He filed a bolt hole through the overlap of each joint and drove a machine bolt through and drew it snug with the pliers. He did this to all 3 joints, then to the joint at the ceramic collar and the joint at the iron cap above. The next train that came through, he sat on the platform with his hands wrapped in strips of the canvas apron from the tool chest and watched the pipe. Nothing moved. He wrote in the notebook that night, sitting cross-legged on the platform, with his blistered palms turned up on his thighs, and the candle burning low on the shelf. The pipe held. The train that broke it taught me what the pipe needed. Every joint from here on will be bolted before it is asked to hold. He turned the page and did not write anything more. The days after the big train were quiet ones. He did not fully know how many. He had started marking small notches on the plank beside the door, with the tip of his knife on the 2nd morning, 1 notch each dawn, and by his count he was somewhere in the 3rd week. But he had missed a day when the burns on his palms made small work difficult, and he had never fully trusted the count after that. It did not matter much. He had nowhere to be. He read the logbook straight through on a night when the wind had come up hard from the north and rattled the tar paper on the roof. He had handled the book carefully since the first evening, kept it wrapped in a fold of the canvas apron on the top shelf where the condensation could not reach it. He had read pieces before. The keeper's entries, the sketches, the water levels, the notes on ice. He had not read it all the way through to the end. He did now by the light of 2 tallow candles set in tin cups on the shelf beside him, with the stove ticking soft and the wind working at the eaves. The first keeper had held the station for 11 years. He had signed each entry with a small looping initial that might have been an H or a K. He had recorded the arrival of every train that stopped for water and had noted their tank draws in gallons and their engineers' names when he knew them. He had complained once in a marginal note about the cold of a January that had frozen the pipe from Cold Spring for 6 days. He had signed off with a single line, handing off. Line good order. The second keeper had held the station for 9 years. His hand was smaller and neater, and he wrote less. He had installed the brass tap in the north wall. In his 3rd year, a note read, because he had grown tired of climbing to the tank whenever he wanted a drink. In his 7th year, he had lost a finger to the pump housing, and had noted the fact with the same flatness with which he had noted the water level that morning. He had signed off, handing off, line in good order. The 3rd keeper had held the station for only 2 years. His hand was rougher, and he wrote almost nothing but the numbers. His entry stopped abruptly one October, in the middle of a week, with no sign-off and no explanation. The next hand was the administrative one. The boy read it now for the 2nd time in the guttering candlelight, and read it slower than he had the first. Water tank number 14 and associated service structures are hereby removed from the Mountain Division Active Operations Register. The advent of diesel-electric locomotives having rendered the taking of water at this and similar stations obsolete. The tank is drained and valved off from the main pump line effective this date. The pump house is secured. The keeper's room is vacated. The Cold Spring feeder line remains in place but is to be considered inactive. No further inspection is required. No maintenance schedule shall apply. This location is closed and removed from record. A signature at the bottom that he could not read. A single stamped impression. Closed. He sat with the book open in his lap and did not turn the page. Below him, some distance below, a freight train came through the tunnel. He felt it first in the tower's iron. Then the sound rose and filled the mountain and passed and folded down and was gone. The tower resettled. The candles did not even bend. The bolts he had driven into every joint of the stovepipe held clean and did not so much as rattle, removed from record. He had understood it in pieces before. In the rust on the padlocked pump house door, in the dust on the tool chest lid, in the ceramic tap that had not been turned in decades but had turned when he asked it to, in the flue that vented smoke where no one would ever look. He had understood it the way you understand weather, in the passing of it across your face. But understanding a thing in pieces was not the same as reading it flat on the page in the hand of the man who had made it official. No railroad clerk in any office, anywhere, kept a schedule that pointed at this tower. No inspector's route ran up this ladder. No maintenance crew was ever coming with a work order. The tower stood on ground the railroad still owned, but had long ago stopped counting. It had stood untouched, not because it had escaped notice, but because it had been noticed once, deliberately, and the notice had been to strike it from the ledger and never notice it again. He closed the book very carefully, and set it back on the shelf, and put the candle out, and sat in the dark with his back against the warm iron of the stove. He slept that night the deepest sleep he had slept in a long time. The morning of what he thought was the 22nd day came in cold and clear. He had been up since before first light. The stove was going. Water was on for tea in a small tin he had scavenged from the section shed on his 2nd trip down. He had eaten a small bowl of rice with a spoonful of lard stirred through it, and had felt it settle warm in his belly, and had felt that in some way he had earned it. The room was as finished as it was going to get. Not perfect. Nothing he had ever built was perfect, but finished the way a thing is finished when every part of it has been tested and held, and been found equal to the life it was meant to serve. The stove drew clean through the hidden flue. The platform slept warm. The shelves held. The door barred from inside. The brass tap ran cold and sweet from a spring nobody remembered, and a pipe nobody knew was live. He climbed out of the room in the last of the daylight, and pulled the door shut behind him and did not bar it. He climbed up the outer ladder past the room, past the tank, all the way to the small iron catwalk that ran around the conical roof at the very top of the tower. He had been up there once before, in the morning after the big train, to check the vent cap. He had not sat up there. He sat now. The catwalk was narrow, and he sat with his legs threaded through the iron rail and his boots hanging in open air 35 feet above the tracks. The pines fell away below him in a dark green wash. The tunnel mouth showed as a black arch in the mountain's face. Above him the sky was still holding the last blue of day, and the first stars were already there, staking their claim. He had the notebook in his lap. He had been writing in it since the second day. Measurements, mostly materials. The occasional line that had slipped through when his guard was down. He opened it to a clean page. Below him the mountain shook. He felt it in the iron under his palms before he heard it. The tremor built long and slow and became the compression of air through the tunnel's near mouth, and became the deep iron thunder of the locomotive rolling under the tower and taking the tunnel in a single long pour. Boxcars, tankers, flatbeds stacked with logs, more boxcars. He watched the roof of each one pass beneath his boots. None of them looked up. None of them ever would. He pressed the pen to the paper. No one is looking up. He read it once. Then he closed the notebook. The last car cleared the tunnel mouth, and the sound thinned and folded down into the mountain and was gone, and the tower resettled around him, and the stars kept coming out one by one until the whole sky above the ridge was burning with them. He sat for a long time. He did not go back inside until the cold had worked through his jacket and into his shoulders, and even then he was slow about it. He climbed down to the platform. He opened the door and stepped in and pulled it closed and dropped the bar into its hooks. The stove was still warm. The candle he had left in the tin cup on the shelf had a fingernail of wick left. He lit it from a splinter he touched to the stove's grate and set it on the shelf and lay down on the platform and pulled the tarp up over his shoulders. The tower creaked once in the wind and settled, and for the first time he could remember, nothing in him was already packing to go.